I tell my race ethnicity classes, I tell them the worst thing you can be that's legal in our society is a racist. Because you'd be stigmatized for that. It's not illegal to be a racist, but you'll be stigmatized for it.
Mm.
Anything that's worse than that is something that's illegal. A murder. Well, that's worse, but that's they'll put you in jail for that.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with George Yancey, who is a sociologist and author of the book Beyond Racial Division. We're looking forward to having a great conversation, so welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So, Dr. Yancey, let's start off. Just tell me a little bit about your background, who you are, where you come from.
Yeah, so I work at Baylor University. I've been there for about 4 years now. I was at University of North Texas. I got my doctorate at UT Austin, so I enjoy that. Go Horns! We're gonna take it to the SEC.
Well, hold on. I invited you on here because you're a Baylor Bear. I was hoping you were going to say Sikkim.
Well, sick 'em too, but I mean we don't play the SEC, so what can I say?
Okay.
When they hired me, I told them, look, I'm still rooting for the Longhorns, except when they play, even when they play Baylor, then I root for Baylor every other time. So
Okay,
that's
that's
the way I work out.
reasonable. That's reasonable.
Yeah, I'm a Christian and I'm a sociologist, and I take both very seriously. And so that's sometimes leads me on paths that anger Christians, and sometimes leads me on paths that anger sociologists. So that sort of sums up my life.
I like that. I want to talk about like how you kind of developed your ideas, like because as you said, you have the Christian influence, you have the sociology influence. It seems from reading you, you seem to be very evidence driven, in a lot of the positions you take. How did you kind of develop these ideas that seem to not fit in neatly in any camp and sometimes anger different people?
Yeah, I mean, I try, and no one's completely unbiased, and no one's completely, we don't have Spocks here. We don't have people who, you know, uh, I'm just looking at the data. I try to do as much as possible, but I admit that I don't. I'm not perfect on that. But my faith gives me certain insights that I take into my science, and my science informs me certain aspects about my faith, and I try to be open to both. Now, my faith is more important than doing the science, so I want to be very clear and open about that. However, the science does give me insight, and so as I look at issues of race, some of the paradigms that I've seen just haven't worked, and I think they haven't worked because scholars bring certain presuppositions into their analysis, and I challenge those presuppositions. And so I think I land on a different spot than a lot of other individuals because of that.
So one of those positions, you had some controversial and I would say hard-hitting takes for Robin DiAngelo and the concept of white fragility. What can you
Yeah.
tell me about how you conceptualize that concept differently from so many in the mainstream?
Well, white fragility from my reading of D'Angelo is basically that whites are so defensive to protect their own interests that they use a variety of different mechanisms so that they don't have to really deal with racial issues. Now, on the surface, I think there's some validity to that. The problem is the way she applies it. So when I read her book, I tried to look at it as if I was a white person reading this book, as well as being a Black Christian sociologist. And I concluded that the only thing I could do as a white person was to agree with people of color and do better. That does not, that's not a recipe for really finding common ground, because believe it or not, people of color actually sin as well. We actually have human depravity. We can misuse people, we can manipulate people, we can do those things as well. We may not have the sort of power historically that whites have had, and so that's true. But that doesn't mean that we're free from that. And so if you just give us the power without really dealing with some of these other issues, then why wouldn't we replicate what we've just seen? So that, I think, at the core, that's the major problem. Now, there's other elements of her work, A White Fragility, that I have problems with and critique. But I think it really falls apart because ultimately, and she says so in the book, really, what white people to do is to listen to people of color and try to do better. And that's the only, they can't do anything else. They can't cry about it. They can't argue. They can't, be defensive. They can't ignore it. That's what they're supposed to do. And I know that that's not the solution.
Yeah, I'm coming at this, I mean, from a number of angles, but the big one is like a mental health angle. And it seems like this idea pushed in white fragility and this concept of like kind of unconscious bias creates anxiety, sometimes even paranoia in white people specifically. People who, prior to a few years ago might not have had any type of racial anxiety. Now they're kind of plagued with this thought, what if I accidentally say something racist? What if a racist thought slips into my head? And the consequence is I'm just going to have less interactions with people of color just because I can't trust my own mind because I know my unconscious is racist in some way. Do you see any of that?
It's a little bit more with gender stuff. For example, men hesitate to hire women because they don't want to be accused of sexual harassment or sexism or things of this nature. I suspect it also happens with racial issues as well, that there may be hesitation somewhat to hire some people of color for fear that they're going to come and accuse you of racism, and that people may be uncomfortable being around people of color because they don't want to become off as racism. They don't know what is racism. It's one of the problems with expanding the definition of racism beyond the normal definition of we think about it as, the sort of the bigot type of thing. We can find other terms and concepts that can encompass institutional types of issues. But I think when you just say it's racism, that sort of puts an onus on whites in a way that's unfair, first of all, and not productive. You do therapy, I don't. But my understanding is part of therapy is to help people to understand where other people are coming from to work out the issues. And that a good therapist would not just categorically take the side of one person, if it's couples theory, of course, I'm talking about that. And just, and then just say, well, this person's wrong, this person's never right. We don't have to be concerned with the interests and needs of that person. And I think that's even true, even in egregious situations. If the guy cheated on the wife, yes, I mean, you come down, load of bricks on the guy for what he's doing, but somehow she's contributing to the issue. Even if her response is only 10%, then you got to address that 10% or else it never gets help. And I think that sometimes we're doing that with the race relations, and I think it contributes to the unhealthy nature of our race relations today.
When you look at people of color and black people specifically, from that mental health angle, do you think some of this anti-racist conversation is creating unnecessary anxiety? Like, well, I'm being told that all white people are just kind of hopelessly racist. So if I believe that and I take that to be true, every time I leave my house, I'm going to be on edge to some degree. Do you see that?
I do think that's an issue. I do think that is a serious problem that we have to concern ourselves about. Part of what I'm saying is we have to have better conversations. And when you think about how you have better conversations, you got to create an atmosphere where that can happen. Social media has taught us one thing very well. Just throwing people together and say talk does not always produce a very healthy conversation. Some people together having them argue so you got to figure out how we're going to have these conversations that are productive, where we can find solutions, goal-oriented conversations, but one in which we build on each other's ideas. And I think that's the key to us finding our way through the situation.
Yeah, I like that. You said we have to have conversations. And so it seems like there's one side saying this is the only conversation to be had, and it has to be had from this very specific angle. And kind of the flip side of that, on the more conservative side, you often see this take of, I don't like the way this conversation is going, so let's ignore the race question altogether and let's just not have this conversation. This conversation makes me uncomfortable. Let's just change the subject. How do you kind of navigate those two extremes?
Yeah, that's a good explanation of sort of colorblindness versus anti-racism dilemma there. And so the way I look at it is, look, to some degree, both sides have a point. I'd probably lean one more way or the other, but I admit the other have a point. I tell people sometimes I am anti-racist, sometimes I'm colorblind. As a professor, when I grade my papers, I'm colorblind. Sometimes I see these situations, I see it from an anti-racism perspective. So it's not that you are always right and you are always wrong or vice versa. We need to figure out, what we have in common, where we can work together, how we can hear from each other. Because I suspect that a lot of the people on, so let's say, the colorblind side don't fully appreciate what the people on anti-racism are saying. Now, some of the people on anti-racism are saying it in very bad ways, in ways that are not conducive to being heard. But the people on the colorblind side don't understand that, and vice versa. that the people on the anti-racism side don't always understand why people feel the way they do on the colorblind side. And so if we understand each other and understand the needs each other may have, then it becomes possible to find a solution that can meet as many of these needs as possible. And I think that that's what we need, because that's what's sustainable. If you're on, if we want to look at the current situation, 2020, because of George Floyd and Albury, the anti-racism side got the attention, got, the feedback, and they were putting these programs in, and a lot of money's being flown towards them and stuff like that. And they didn't bother to listen to anyone else. Today, you have the reverse situation. You have people saying, let's end DEI, and, we'll be objective, and it's just, who is very qualified, and we'll get rid of all this focus on race. And they're not listening to the other concerns. And so we just go back and forth rather than saying, hey, maybe there's something on both sides, and maybe we can find some sort of the middle, so that when one side has power, the other side has something to do other than tear them down, which is what we kind of do today.
I'm interested if you've commented on Coleman Hughes, who has a book called The End of Race Politics, which he kind of describes as like a kind of defending the colorblind perspective, but his position doesn't seem like knee-jerk, ignore the issue. I think at least from his perspective, he kind of presents it as the natural continuation of Dr. King's vision. I'm wondering if you like have anything to say on that.
Yeah, I've not read that book, so I can't comment specifically on that book. I will say that, King does have the famous line that people like to quote, content of character. King also recognized institutional racism as well. And so if we're going to talk about King, we need to talk about King in a holistic sense and not just take that one line, which I think most of us would say, yes. I mean, definitely there's situations where content of character matters. For my sons, the woman they marry, I care a lot more about their content, the woman's character, than their racial skin. In fact, I don't really care about their racial skin. So yeah, I mean, it's a great line, but it's not the entirety of the King's message. So I'm not saying Hughes does that since I've not read the book. I'm just saying that when sometimes I hear people concentrate on that one line and forget that he also talked about how institutions work against people of color and how they have to be challenged.
Could you tell me more about how your Christian faith informs these ideas as you see the race issue?
Yeah, so one of the key differences that I think my faith brings, that I think is underappreciated, is the nature of humans. Excuse me. In a Christian mindset, there's the concept of human depravity, which means that we're all fallen, we all fall short, we all have our shortcomings, and none of us are going to ever reach it. Now, what really drove me to see how important this was back in graduate school, when I was taking theory courses in history of social thought and the Enlightenment movement, which I really had not read that much about until I went to graduate school. And the Enlightenment movement really focused in on this notion of perfectibility, that humans are perfectible, and that if we, if we get the right systems, we'll end. And this developed further along the line. We'll end, racism and classism and poverty. We just got to create, and you could kind of see this a little bit in Marxism. In fact, you can see a lot in Marxism if you really know your Marx. That Marx was talking about with the right economic system, we create better people, and that clashes with depravity. So the implications of this, I think, are huge. If you believe humans are perfectible, then you believe that a group can come up with the ideas that will create this sort of perfect society. And if that's true, then what you have to do is find these ideas, and once you have these ideas, implement them however you can, and to beat back any opposition to these ideas. Hence Marxism, hence certain types of humanist progressive ideologies, hence some on the conservative side have said, no, you got to do this no matter what. If you perceive human depravity, though, you realize that your ideas, as good as they may be, are not gonna be perfect, because you're not perfectible. And so we work towards perfectibility, understand our own weaknesses, and thus we must communicate and work with others who may have different ideas. I'll tell you another way that this is just huge as far as implications. What's been called cancel culture makes perfect sense in perfectibility. if if we're perfectible and someone is working against that, you know, be it that they are a bigot or ignorant or what have you, well, we got to deal with them. And if we have to cancel them to make them an example, that's what we do because they're in the way of perfectibility. On the other hand, if you believe that, you know what, I think I have great ideas, but I may not have all the ideas. This person who may be having thoughts and says things that I find disagreeable, I need to find a way to bring them along or learn from them. They're not to be canceled, they're to be redeemed. So people become redeemable rather than need to perfect them. And so you focus in on, okay, do I have something to learn? Or will they learn from me? And can I bring them in here? I don't have to make them an example because I've not reached perfection either. I've got to reach out to them and help bring them along. And it bothers me when I see Christians on the conservative side move more towards the cancel culture mentality because really that's antithetical to human depravity. We don't cancel people; we try to redeem them. And I just think that's a huge paradigm that I use as I try to approach this work and other work that I do.
That is so fascinating to me because you see Christians across the political perspectives with talking about, from an enlightened perspective, we need a more efficient society because that would be God's will, or kind of the Marxian liberation theology. We're going to create the kingdom of heaven here on earth because that's God's will. And everybody's presenting it as though like my ideas are backed by God. And what you're saying is like, you're completely missing the whole concept of human nature that the Bible teaches us.
Yeah, I think that the temptation is to think that I've reached perfection, or at least I'm further ahead than those other people. And it's natural for I mean, if I disagreed with an idea, I would stop holding it. So of course I believe my ideas are correct. But do I have the humbleness to say they may not be correct? I mean, I think they're correct at this time. But undoubtedly there's some ideas I have right now that are incorrect. If I'm the average person, then I have an average number of incorrect ideas. So can I be humble enough to think they might not be correct? And therefore, I need to be careful about how I approach the ideas. I should promote them, yes, but I should be open to the fact that I can learn from others and the implications of that. And so that's part of how I see things. Yeah.
That is interesting. I think just looking at my time in academia, professors that I respect a lot more are the ones who have that intellectual humility to say, like, there's a lot that I don't know, or, here's a little bit that I do know, but I don't know this over here. People who have like those kind of nuanced answers, I tend to trust them more.
I agree. I mean, I don't tend to trust people who are always progressive or always conservative.
Mm.
And part of it is because I just think political ideology is a social construction. So it seems to me that at some point you got to say, well, I'm a progressive, but this idea doesn't seem to fit with my values or vice versa. And I guess that's part of why I'm a political independent. But I'm not saying everyone needs to. I mean, I can respect you if you're, hey, I'm mostly conservative. I can respect that. I have a hard time respecting someone who says, well, what did the progressives say? That's what I have to believe. And I think that happens a lot. And it happens with conservatives too.
I think one of the issues that you run into here, I agree with you, like on a philosophical level, that makes a lot of sense. But on a practical level, that puts a big cognitive load onto people. Say, I have to decide every issue for myself as opposed to just kind of straight ticket, like my side is right. My side is right is a very like intellectually easy position. It's not very stressful for me to take on that. It's actually pretty tough to go issue by issue and decide, for myself.
One of the things is there's certain issues that I've just not got enough information about. And so I'll just give you an example. Global warming. I've not really read into the literature. I don't have the time to really read into the literature. I would love to hear from both sides but I just don't have the time. And so I'm comfortable saying there's certain issues that I just don't speak out about. I mean, I know I get in trouble on social media by speaking out on stuff, but I speak on things that I've at least thought through a little bit. Other stuff, I have not thought that much about it, and I don't feel obligated to really lean into those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a university professor, but just as a regular guy, I feel some kind of pressure to be an expert on everything. Some new issue comes out, and it's like I need to read 5 articles on this so that the next time someone asks me, I'll have a good answer. And it's like I'm not an economist. I'm not going to have a great answer on tariffs. I'm just going to tell you, one thing I heard. I'm not going to, it's so unreasonable to expect us to be experts on all these issues when the world is so big and complex.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I think to do what we're talking about doing is don't just, you know, agree with an issue because it's on your side, is also be comfortable with ambiguity on issues that you've not really studied, that you've not really read about. And maybe you won't have the time and maybe it's not high enough. I mean, I'm sure some people out there are saying, well, why aren't you reading more on global warming? Because it's a very important issue for them. And that's fine. I have issues I think are very important that I want to spend my time on. And so I'm comfortable saying on that argument, I just stay out of it.
I'm wondering if you could touch on political polarization, because that's kind of come up a little bit. I'm trying to remember. I was reading in Jonathan Haidt where talking about how, like in 1960, for instance, parents would have hated their kids, just overwhelmingly hated their kids bringing home someone, a romantic partner of a different race, but they didn't really care if it was, the other political party. And now that's flipped, where there's a lot more acceptance of having an in-law of a different race, but it would be very, very bad to have a Democrat if you're a Republican family, or vice versa. Can you talk a little bit about that polarization?
Yeah, I've become convinced, and I'm old enough to have been through where people are very open about not dating outside their race, or their parents are very open about they wouldn't let their kids. I mean, very open. I mean, I know it happens today, but people are not as open about it. So it wasn't that long ago where people were very open about that. So today, where it's politics, and when I look at some data sets, I can clearly see that the political division is stronger in many ways than the racial division. In fact, uh, the best predictor of racial attitudes is not race itself, it's political ideology. Race matters, it's still significant in any model you put in, but political ideology has higher, you know, has a higher impact factor. So yeah, for whatever reason, and I've read some people have said, back in the day, we didn't attach idea like you had conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. It was more of, yeah, this is my party. It's kind of like my team, but it really doesn't affect as much my actual beliefs. And I think that changed around, I want to say around the 1980s or so. I think something about the Gingrich Revolution, or maybe the 1990s, where, where we begin to more line up towards, the Democrats are the progressives and the Republicans are the conservatives. And that probably had a big deal to creating this. So, for whatever reason, and I don't have all the reasons why, political polarization, I would argue, is deeper than racial polarization in our society today.
Do you think that part of that issue is, if I look at somebody of a different race, like they didn't choose their race,
Mhm.
but I can say at least to some degree, you chose your political ideology. So it doesn't seem moral for me to judge you for the color of your skin, but I feel morally justified. Like you chose to adopt this evil ideology. Does that make sense?
But I mean, if you look back 40 years ago, 50 years ago, people felt free to have animosity towards others based on race, even though it was not chosen. So that has sort of changed. And I tell my race ethnicity classes, I tell them the worst thing you can be that's legal in our society is a racist. Because you'd be stigmatized for that. It's not illegal to be a racist, but you'll be stigmatized for it. Anything that's worse than that is something that's illegal. A murder. Well, that's worse, but that's they'll put you in jail for that. So that sort of pressure, I think, made it good in a way, because it does make it harder for people to discriminate on others based purely on race. But yeah, when it comes to politics, people can believe that, hey, this person is going to destroy the country if our team loses, and that has all sorts of pernicious type of effects.
You said, I forget exactly how you say it, racist is the worst thing that you can be that's legal to be. Do you feel like the word racist is overused? Because a lot of the ideology, like CRT ideology, would tell us that all white people are racist, and it seems like that's a very heavy word. So what that tells me is David Duke, former leader of the KKK, is a racist, just like some white person who's devoted their whole life to fighting against racism is a racist. Those are just people in the same category. Do you feel like that's overused at all?
Yeah. First, I'm not sure all CRTs use that. I know a lot of anti-racism uses that all whites are racist and stuff like that. But I do take your point very well that there has to be a need to differentiate what you mean by racist if you're going to use it that way. Uh, say David Duke is the same thing as someone who disagrees with you on affirmative action. That's worlds apart. You may argue that person who disagrees with you on affirmative action. I can't talk right now. On affirmative action, that they're wrong. You can say that they're insensitive to the plight of people of color. That's all fair game. But then they used racist, and they turn around and say David Duke is a racist. That's a totally different element. And what happens is the word loses its meaning. People get used to being called a racist for disagreement. And so when you use it in a term that would make a lot more sense, people go, well, but you call everyone a racist. So why would I believe you now? So I think we have to be very careful. I prefer to talk about a racialized society, because I think that that's more explanatory, that race still matters. I think that that's very much more defensible than saying we're a racist society. And then, if I really want to call something a racist, people know that I'm talking about someone who believes that their race is superior to others and, has that sort of traditional animosity. I think there's other ways we can talk about it and say, hey, this is a problem without having to go to that sort of dynamic.
Do you feel, I'm trying to figure out how to word this question, do you feel that overuse of the word racism has given cover to actual racists? Because I've seen like a rise in recent years of, I mean, some people call it the alt-right. There's a number of different labels that you could put on it, but I would say actual racist is what I would say. And when you confront them, they say, well, what does even racist mean? Everybody's a racist, right? So who cares? Do you feel like they're getting like flying undercover?
And I think it does help people who really have that type of racial animosity to escape from being judged or assessed as racist. Yes, I think that is one of the problems with the overextension of the term racist, is that it does allow people who do have animosity to to attack to just say, okay, I'm no better than this person, I'm no worse than this person who just disagrees with you.
I'm wondering if you could comment. I mean, part of this is race, but there's other things going on too. Gender's a big one as well. But I mentioned the all right, but you've also got this kind of, I mean, there's different words: manosphere, red pill, incel, these type of things, and it's almost like identity politics in reverse, to where it's like, how about identity politics for white people or affirmative action for men? How are you seeing this kind of rise of this almost like mirror image on what looks like the right wing of this country?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I've actually been doing some reading and research into identity politics. And my perspective is to look at it on the left and on the right. And I do think that while they're not exactly the same, you find a lot of commonalities because I think that the setup of identity politics feeds into certain types of dysfunctions. It has the advantage of short-term political victories because, the notion of identity politics is that we are fighting for a certain group that's being oppressed. And that gives you a certain amount of legitimation. And so when you make demands, you say, hey, we're making demands because this group's being mistreated. They're being devalued. And of course, people, feel they feel like, oh yeah, we gotta protect that group. So I think it's very tempting because you can get some, at least in the short term, you can get some movement. You can get some victories out of it. Long term, I think that it's very damaging, and I think it damages your cause because it turns off people. People who they, it tends to, the language of it tends to dehumanize the out group. It tends to set up a sort of hostility that people begin to pick up. And so it starts creating its own resistance because of the nature of it. And whether it's on the left or the right, I think that's the natural consequence of identity politics. So, yeah, just to get back to your question, I do see identity politics. In fact, I would argue that identity politics helped Trump to win in 2016 and this previous election. And he tapped into that. He tapped into that sort of identity politics. A lot of it was white identity politics, some Christian identity politics. I don't know if there was much of a, in 2016, the manosphere type of identity politics, but I think it's kind of come alive in 2024. What people call red pill, is something that I've just sort of looked at a little bit. So yeah, I think that has come about, and we can see it on both the left and the right.
I'm wondering, I mean, this is going in all different directions that I didn't plan, but I love it. I'm wondering if you could tell me about this, like conceptualize the right-wing coalition, because it doesn't make sense to me, where you've got this brash, egotistical, womanizing president supported by evangelical Christians. You've got this manosphere stuff. You've got, like different MAGA stuff. You've got traditional libertarian stuff. It seems like these groups don't belong together, but yet they are together. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of speculating on this a bit, but I think part of it is that the Republican Party has changed. I think a lot of Christians are thinking about the Republican Party of Reagan and Bush one and maybe Bush two a little bit. Uh, this Republican Party is it's not the how should I put this? I think at one point in time, the major impact of the Republican Party, it wasn't the only. The major impact was that the conservative Christian wing of it, which was pushing a lot of social conservatism. And the Republican Party was the home for it. And I think the Democrats reacted to that and, of course, went far in the other direction, and so you had that. The conservative Christian is still a part of the Republican Party, but it's no longer under his or her control the way it used to be. It is, it's become, I think, more libertarian in certain ways, more of a, for lack of a better term, an anti-woke party, but not necessarily a socially conservative party. And the conservative Christian has a place in it, but it's not as prominent as it used to be. And so and maybe it's not any politics, which has created multiple interest groups that are working together for some common interests, but also they have different perspectives, different ways that they want things done. And I think it's been a problem that Democrats have had and still have today, but it's coming more to the Republican Party at this point in time. And I think what's going to happen is that conservative Christians are going to find out, if they've not already found out, that their voice, while not marginalized, has been reduced in today's Republican Party. So they're on the winning team, but they have a less of a voice on that winning team. And so they have to decide what do they want? Is this what they're satisfied with? Because I think that's the reality for today.
That's interesting. Something that's coming up is it feels like religion is far less salient to most Americans today than politics. And I see this on the left and the right, where, traditionally it would be obviously I'm a Christian first, and then also I'm a Democrat, also I'm a Republican, what have you. And today it seems like my politics come first. Secondarily, I'm Christian, and, I just assume Jesus would vote like I do. Do you see that?
Yeah, there's actually a book, I forget the name of the book, that actually makes the argument that we tend to think that, you have religion and politics flows out of that, but it's really the other way around. Politics and religion flows out of that. And I think that is true for some people. I definitely think that's true for some. Whether it's true for the majority of the people, I'm not convinced, but I definitely think it's true. And I think it's true on the left and the right. As perhaps, say, 10, 15 years ago, you could probably make a credible argument that was more true on the left than the right. I'm not sure you can make that argument today. I think today, as far as I could be convinced with data. So I'm not saying I know this is the case, but it seems to me that this sort of I do my politics and my religion flows out of that is as common on the right as it is on the left.
Interesting. As a Christian, is there part of you that's weary about getting into politics? Like for me personally, as a Christian, like something just doesn't sit easy with me about kind of embracing either side, because it's like, I feel like there's so many warnings in the Bible about putting your hope in kind of like an earthly kingdom. Does that come up for you?
Yeah, I mean, me personally, I vote and, I talk about political issues. for me, I hold that lightly, relatively speaking. So if my political side loses or what I want loses, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. I some of the catastrophizing that you see in politics is it's very off-putting, and I'm disturbed when Christians engage in that type of mentality. I mean, I'm okay with Christians say, hey, I think you should vote for such and such or on this issue. We're citizens of this country. We have every right to say that as anyone else, but we should not be panicking that our side's going to lose, because that means our faith is somewhere else. So yeah, that does bother me.
Interesting. So I'm wondering, one of the things I'm, in grad school to become a therapist, you started seeing clients, things like that. And I feel like my education on race and multiculturalism has been very subpar. And, it seems like the worst of both worlds. It seems like, on kind of the left-wing sense of things, it's a heavily politicized, kind of obsession with multiculturalism. But on the other side, it's almost colorblind in the sense we're not actually talking about it. The formula seems to be like whiteness is problematic, therefore you should have left-wing views. But we never actually talk about how would I counsel a Latina woman or a black man with depression. Like, we never actually get into those actual issues. It's just kind of very superficial and political. So if you were advising a therapist or someone teaching therapists, what would you tell them that they need to know about multiculturalism and race specifically?
Yeah, I would say, need to learn some of the cultural differences, because to me, it seems like that would be very relevant to a therapist. That there are, I'll just give you one example. For the African community, titles are very important. Excuse me.
That's you.
Titles are very important. Titles are important for African Americans historically because we were denied our titles. You could become a doctor or a lawyer and you're still called a boy or by your first name. Whereas we had to, and so when you go to the black church, suppose a white church, it's always pastor or reverend. It's never Bob or Jane. In white churches, it can be that way. Now, I think that that's an important cultural element to be aware of if you're counseling African Americans. It may not be relevant. It probably won't be relevant in a lot of situations, but sometimes it may be relevant. Why a person feels his or her title is so important and wants to protect it and respect it in a different way that you might expect from European Americans. Well, I find European Americans, they emphasize lack of titles because they're emphasizing equality. And so I'm not criticizing European Americans for not emphasizing titles. I'm just saying it's different. I'm not talking criticizing African Americans either. I'm just saying it's different. And those are the differences that you would want to be aware of if you are dealing with counseling different cultures. You can't learn about all cultures. So my recommendation is if you're in a community that tends to have certain types of cultures, you should learn more about those cultures. You can learn, through books. You can learn through having people over and talking to them about it, asking them questions. But I would emphasize cultural knowledge more than, I would not want to get into the sort of the political dynamics of multiculturalism and that sort of stuff. Because I think for your profession, that's less useful.
There seems to be, and this is kind of what I see from a lot of social justice activism broadly, but it's certainly true in my program. And like the assumption is, if you're a good ally to racial minorities, then you need to have far left-wing politics. And from many racial minorities that I've worked with or been friends with or coworkers with, there tends to be a wide range of very nuanced opinions on these issues. And the way it's presented in a lot of the social justice literature is very one-dimensional and kind of surface-level presentation of like, this is Black thought. Whereas like, if you look at just, some of the top Black intellectuals, they're all across the board politically.
That is true. I mean, it is ironic because one of the things that we tell, one of the things of white privilege tenets is that, you're not speaking for the whole entire white race when you speak. Yet some of those same people then say, well, but this is the Black thought. So there's a sort of ironic type of hypocrisy about that. Yeah, African Americans were varied as any other group as far as our thinking. And I think we're seeing more and more of that, even politically in the coming years.
There's also this kind of tension where on certain issues, like traditional gender roles, for instance, African Americans are more likely to be on the conservative side. And so that creates kind of this tension of how we talk about this issue, because the assumption is like Black people, far left wing, but on this issue, more conservative. and there's like a disconnect of how we even are supposed to talk about this issue, and it seems to create like discomfort in a lot of people.
Yeah, things, I was talking about, Democrats have their problems with trying to keep all these special interest groups happy. This is one of the issues where it matters because African Americans tend to be more socially conservative than whites in general, but they tend to vote more Democrats. And so I think they're trying to figure this out. How do we placate some of the interests that are much more socially progressive on these issues and still maintain our hold on the African American voting population? That's an issue that they have to figure out or try to work out. And I think that's one of the struggles Democrats have.
I'm not sure if you know what cognitive behavioral therapy is, CBT.
I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah, it's kind of like a logical approach to look at your thoughts and see if they're irrational. You kind of challenge and redirect them. So if I say everything is terrible, well, the reality is that some things are bad, some things are good. So I take a more nuanced approach to it, and so then that approach is less catastrophizing, and so it eases some of my anxiety, tension, depression, that kind of thing. That's the general idea. And I've been told by multiple professors that CBT is inappropriate to use for racial minorities because rationality is racist. That sounds just bizarrely offensive to me, and I'm wondering if you have a take on that.
Yeah, I mean, my initial take is offensive. Yeah, I like to think of myself as a rational person, so that is offensive. I think that's a political statement more than a racial statement. I mean, I don't know if they know how it sounds when it comes out of their mouths. I don't, I, maybe there's some African American professors who are also pushing that idea as well. I think that's one thing that goes with identity politics, that you lose a certain amount of rationality because the winning the political victory becomes everything. And if you have to sacrifice rationality in order to do it, then you do. And once again, that's true on the left and the right, but I think that this is an example of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with a number of racial minorities. My background is in addiction treatment, and addiction treatment, you use CBT principles all the time. And people tend to be, people of all different races tend to be grateful because they find them empowering. Here's some tools that I can hold on to that are going to empower me to take more control of my life. And it seems like that goes against the mentality of, kind of the mindset seems to be you're supposed to encourage people to adopt a victimhood mentality. One of the bizarre things is they would say if you have like a heterosexual middle class white male client, you can use kind of these gold standard tools like cognitive behavioral therapy. But if it's any kind of racial minority or a woman or a gay client, you need to essentially be kind of like affirming victimhood. And to me, that's like the most privileged clients get the best therapy, and more marginalized clients get worse therapy. Like that, it just seems so counterintuitive. I don't know if you can unpack that for me at all, that mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand. I mean, I understand we have to contextualize certain things. And so the way we may approach people may be different in the context, but it seems to me that to just generalize, say, if you're from this group, this is how you think. Yeah, there may be tendencies, but I think it seems to me that you would want to make sure that you're approaching this person individually in a way that's useful and productive. That's what it seems to me it would be like.
You mentioned the importance of titles in like African American culture. I'm wondering, could you say anything more based on race that you might observe about like mental health tendencies in different populations that you would need to know, like specific compared to like just like a white population?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying in general, there's cultural differences that we could look at. I mean, I reject the rationality one, but there are legitimate cultural differences. I'll give you another one, CPT, color people's time, that hits a real thing. Now, part of it is that the mentality is, and once again, I'm much more of an on time person, but the mentality is that, hey, the event starts when we get there. So the event, you may say 5, but the event's not gonna start till we get there. If we get there at 5:30, then the event starts when we get there. And so that's a different type of perspective. And so, there's other cultural differences. Probably, I'll have to sit down and really think through a lot of them. But the key to me is trying to learn some of these differences that help you to appreciate and contextualize to having different clients. Because even if you have an individual like myself who's on time a lot, knowing that there's a different time orientation over time, if you're counseling a lot of African Americans, that's going to become a factor, but to understand that perspective. So while you wouldn't want to say, all right, George Yancey's black, he doesn't come on time. You don't want to do that. But you want to say George Yancey's black, he may have a time orientation where he sees the event starting when he gets there. And if that's applicable to the situation you're talking about, then that's a useful bit of information. You know, uh, I mean, I think that we can look at some of these differences, cultural differences, and to help appreciate it as far as the sort of counseling that people may want to engage in.
That's kind of an interesting example with the time thing, because I know it's similar in a lot of Latino cultures. It's similar in like Italian culture with that time mentality. A lot of therapists book their clients back to back to back. So if you had a client from one of these cultures who shows up late, you can't extend the time because you're running into the next client. Like you're giving them less time. That seems like that puts you in kind of a tough position, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I don't know what all the answers is. I mean, I get, even though there is this time mentality, usually most people know when they have to be. Like, if students show up late in my class, I don't stay in class half an hour later because they showed up a half an hour late. If they've lost that material and that may affect them on the test. So students adjust to that reality. And so I think there are situations you can adjust to that reality. I think when it comes to events showing up later, it's more sometimes like more social events, sometimes church events, things of that nature that people of color tend to. But yeah, you do live in America, and there are certain expectations in America, and so that'd be my approach towards it per se. Uh, but I just think that let's say you're having a conflict with a client as far as him or her struggling in relationships because of this sort of time orientation. That may be something that you want to address, but not address it from the point of view as you gotta actually change. Maybe they need to understand this is their culture. All right, so maybe they need to be more forthcoming. I'm not a therapist. I'm just saying. I'm just throwing stuff out there. You can tell me if this is just nonsensical, but maybe they need to be forthcoming about how they are when they meet people, and maybe people need to understand them. Maybe they need to find compromises, things of this nature. But just to blow it off and say that they're wrong because they're late, I think that may be something that's problematic if you're counseling people from a different culture. So that's just something that would just throw out there.
So one of the things you run into, this is another interesting one that I see, is challenging or confrontation with a client. So a client might be doing some kind of self-destructive behavior, drugs, for instance, in their life, and kind of what we're being taught is, again, the more privileged client, your middle class heterosexual white male client, confrontation is like appropriate. Hey, is your cocaine use contributing to your financial issues and your issues in your marriage? Let's look at this. Kind of like confronting the problems head on. And if it's any type of marginalized client, like a racial minority, you're skirting around that. And so it seems like the more directness is giving better care to a more privileged client. I'm wondering, like, is there something like in like a sociology of race issue where like it might be inappropriate for a white therapist to challenge a black client, or would it be more appropriate to address that issue more directly? How would you see that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think it's going to differ for different people. I mean, even there's some whites that you would not want to confront directly. I mean, I've had white friends that have had problems that I knew I could not confront them directly. So I don't think this is unique to just people of color. A person of color comes in and they have a more of an anti-racist mentality, and they have a white therapist. First thing is maybe they don't need a white therapist. I mean, just to be honest, I mean, maybe there's a time we can't be colorblind because maybe for this person, for the person to say what they need to be said, maybe they need to hear it from a person of color. If that person retains as a therapist, then I think that the therapist has to find ways to communicate with people. My understanding of Asian American culture is that this is also a big issue as far as confrontation for a different reason. And Asian Americans don't, in certain types of ethnicities, tend to, direct direct confrontation does not work well with them. That doesn't work. There's issues of shame and things of this nature that you have to be aware of. I just would suggest that, consider whether or not you that this person really needs a person of his or her own race as a therapist. And then if they retain a different race therapist, that person needs to adjust. But I think they would have to adjust with certain whites who do not want confrontation as well.
When you look at the field of sociology, do you see political bias as having a negative effect?
Yeah. I mean, because we don't do certain types of research because of it. I think we're and this may be true in counseling. If you because of the bias, you may people be less able to serve certain types of groups of people because of the if if we're into a more of a humanist type of perspective, then when it comes to serving people who have religious faith, we're less equipped for that. I think it leads to misunderstandings. Think it sometimes leads to bad science. So yeah, I definitely can see it as problematic.
I meant to ask you this question much earlier, but got lost in really good conversation. Your book, Beyond Racial Division: A Unifying Alternative to Colorblindness and Anti-Racism. Could you just give me a little rundown of what that book is about?
Yeah, so I do try to, I critique colorblindness and anti-racism and try to look at the research showing why they're not working. I approach it with a Christian perspective. And so I also make an argument about human depravity and what I call a collaborative conversation approach, which I think is a better way of handling it. I make a theological argument as well, therefore. And I do try to end with some practical ways in which we might try to push forward on it. And so it's trying to find a way where your side doesn't have to win in order for you to implement this. You don't have to, beat back all the anti-racists or all the colorblindness so that you can do what you want to do, because you're not going to keep them beat back forever. We can find ways we can come together and find solutions that we can agree upon and work together on. And that's what my ministry, what
I like that. I like that. I feel like that could be really useful in a lot of places, including my field of therapy and mental health. So I really appreciate that. When you look at kind of just across the board with classes in multiculturalism, DEI trainings, diversity trainings, that type of thing, if you could kind of wave a magic wand, how would you fix that or improve that?
implement principles that research has shown has some positive effect. For example, I would almost get rid of completely the person standing up front talking to 100 people model. I would want to focus on skill development, developing skills of learning how to take the perspective of others. I would want to focus in on elements such as communication skills, learning how to, having people realize what's vital and what's extra in what they want, so that they can hold on to the vital and give away the extra and compromise to get support in that. So I would focus in on those sort of elements. And programs that are doing that, those programs, I would shovel the resources to. Programs that are not doing that, I would let them dry up.
I like that. I like that. I have one final question for you, Dr. Yancey, and that is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
My big thing is just a general state of our polarization. I mean, I think it comes out in a lot of different ways, but it really hampers us from being able to solve our social problems, because if someone has a good idea, we look to see if they have a D or an R beside their name, and then we decide whether or not we like the idea. And so, can we overcome that sort of polarization? I would like the church to be part of the solution. We're part of the problem. I don't think we're the source of the problem. I think we're part of the problem too often. And I'd like for us to be part of the solution. If we don't do it, we have to find some ways of lessening the polarization and not run into our social political corners every time an issue comes up, and figuring out who we support, who we don't like, based on, do they have the right political ideas?
That is so good. I'm trying to remember the study. I can't remember exactly, but they would ask people, what do you think of Donald Trump coming out in support of universal health care? And all of a sudden, Democrats who initially supported it were against it, and Republicans who were against it now supported it. And
Wow.
it's just so, you put this mask on and people just completely change.
Yeah, I do know there's some research out there that shows that that you can, I don't want to say trigger, what's the right term? But there's a term for it, that signal, that when you signal something, that changes people's perspective. And, so if they're conservative, you signal that's an idea from a liberal, they don't like it. But if they would like it was by a conservative.
It's so bizarre because for so many years, like tariffs and protectionist trade policy was your Bernie Sanders types, your very
Yeah,
progressive people. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump comes along and, oh, that's a Republican position now.
yeah,
Nobody seemed to question that.
right. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, wow. Well, this is a fascinating conversation, Dr. Yancey. Love talking to you, and I'd love to talk to you again anytime.
Thanks, Ryan.